Tuesday night, a regular one. The kind that doesn't feel important while it's happening. I was sitting in my car in a parking lot, engine still running, phone lighting up my face, when a message came in. I read it once, barely processed it, and felt myself nod slightly without realizing it. My thumbs already knew what to type. Sure. It came out clean and automatic, like I'd rehearsed it. Nothing big was being asked, nothing dramatic. Just another small plan, another add-on, another thing that technically didn't matter. That's what made it easy. I sat there for a few seconds longer than usual, not stressed, not annoyed, not worried about money at all. And that part stuck with me later, because if someone had asked me right then whether I just spent money, I probably would have said no. I would have said I was just being easygoing, keeping things smooth, not making it awkward. I drove home like normal, no guilt, no regret. Just this faint sense that I'd agreed to something without ever really seeing it. A lot of my money disappears in the name of keeping things smooth. Not fun, not excitement, just smooth. Covering a coffee so no one has to pause. Upgrading something so there's no back and forth. Adding the extra option because it keeps the moment moving. It never feels like spending. It feels like maintenance. Like wiping a counter or clearing a notification you don't want to look at. I used to tell myself it was generosity or flexibility or just being relaxed about money. But when I really sit with it, most of those moments didn't make me happier. They just ended faster. An $8 coffee quietly becomes 12. A meal picks up another 10 without changing how it tastes. A delivery fee slides in because going back out feels heavier than tapping confirm. Individually, none of it sets off alarms. There's no rush, no warning, but stacked together, month after month, it starts to feel like I'm paying rent on comfort, like I'm leasing peace instead of owning it. And I didn't notice for a long time because everything always stayed fine. That's usually how it gets you. For a long time, I had this phrase that lived in my head like a permission slip. It's only $5. $5 for a bigger coffee. $5 for the faster option. $5 to avoid doing something twice. Every time I said it, I felt reasonable, controlled. Like I clearly wasn't the kind of person who had a spending problem. $5 didn't feel like money that counted. It felt more like a rounding error in life. The uncomfortable part is how often I said it. A few times a week, easily, sometimes a few times a day, and nothing ever pushed back. There was no moment where my brain said, hey, this is adding up. It just kept letting those fives through like they were harmless. At some point, 5 turned into 10, and 10 into 15, and the phrase stayed the same. It's only $5. Looking back, it feels less like logic and more like a reflex I trained myself to trust without checking. A lot of these decisions didn't even happen in my own head. They happened in group texts. Someone suggests dinner. Someone floats a plan. A few people reply fast, and suddenly there's momentum. By the time it's my turn, the choice doesn't feel like yes or no. It feels like keep up or slow everything down. I almost never wanted to be the person who slowed it down, so I'd answer quickly, sure. Not because I'd thought about the cost, but because I didn't want to be the pause. Money always showed up later. When the bill hit. When the calendar reminder popped up. When it was too late to feel casual about backing out. I'd tell myself it was fine, that I'd already agreed, that making it weird now would be worse. What bothered me later wasn't the money itself. It was how rarely I remembered actually choosing it. At some point, I finally did the math, and I didn't even mean to. It wasn't a big sit-down moment. I was just staring at a bank app scrolling past transactions that all looked harmless on their own. $15 here, 12 there. Another 10 that didn't ring a bell? I picked one habit I barely remembered agreeing to and counted it out. About $15 twice a week. That didn't sound like anything. Until I stretched it out. $30 a week. Roughly $120 a month. About $1,400 a year. Just like that. Nothing flashy. No big purchase to point at. Just a quiet line item that followed me around. The part that landed heavy wasn't the number itself. It was how little I'd felt it happening. I never thought of myself as someone who leaked money, but there it was, written out. attached to something I'd been calling no big deal. I think a lot of that spending came from not wanting to be a certain kind of person, the one who hesitates, the one who asks questions, the one who changes the vibe. Money became a way to stay easy, to stay agreeable, to stay out of the spotlight. I'd pay a little extra so nobody had to wait or explain or feel awkward, and it worked socially. Things stayed light, but afterward I'd feel this low-grade exhaustion I couldn't really explain, like I'd done emotional labor with my wallet. I told myself I was just being generous, but generosity usually feels good. This felt more like relief. Relief that I didn't have to say no. Relief that I didn't have to justify anything. Over time, that relief got expensive. And I didn't notice because it never felt like a choice. It just felt like who I was. Convenience slowly turned into something I paid for every month without calling it that. Delivery apps were the obvious one, but it wasn't just food. It was faster shipping, easier options, the version of things that required the fewest steps when I was already tired. None of it felt like a commitment. There was no moment where I said, I'm choosing this lifestyle. It just showed up as a pattern. $10 here to save 20 minutes. Another few dollars there to avoid a small hassle. When I added it up later, it looked a lot like a subscription I'd never agreed to. What made it uncomfortable was realizing how often tiredness made the decision for me. After a long day, I didn't want to think. I wanted the smoothest path to being done. And money kept offering itself as the shortcut. I didn't feel reckless. I felt efficient. That's what made it easy to miss how permanent it had become. Most of my fastest yeses happened when I was already worn down. End of the day, end of the week. That space where your brain is still working, but only enough to keep things moving. I'd tell myself I'd think about it later. That future version of me would sort it out. The problem is, later almost never came. The charge would go through, the moment would pass, and I'd move on. What stuck with me was how quiet those decisions were. No excitement, no regret, just silence. I didn't feel like I'd chosen anything. I felt like something had been chosen for me. When I finally noticed the pattern, it wasn't dramatic. It was more like realizing I'd been standing on a moving walkway the whole time, letting it carry me forward because walking felt harder. The money didn't disappear loudly. It drifted off while I wasn't paying attention. A lot of the things I spent money on were supposed to be occasional. That was always the story. Just this week, just tonight, just because it's been a long day. And the first few times that was true, it really did feel rare. The problem is that repetition doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up and say, hey, this is a habit now. It just quietly replaces the space where intention used to be. At some point, the thing I did once in a while became the normal version of my week. And I didn't remember when that happened. I couldn't point to a moment where it crossed a line. It just felt familiar, comfortable, expected. That's what made it hard to question. When something feels normal, it stops feeling optional. And when it stops feeling optional, it stops feeling like spending. It just feels like how life costs now. This is the part I didn't really want to look at first. Not because the numbers were scary, but because the reason behind them was uncomfortable. When I stripped it down, a lot of my spending wasn't about wanting things. It was about avoiding something else. Avoiding inconvenience. Avoiding awkwardness. Avoiding the feeling of being the odd one out. I wasn't buying enjoyment. I was buying the absence of discomfort. And that's harder to see because there's nothing to point at afterward. No item. No memory. Just a moment that went smoothly and disappeared. Sitting with that felt strange because it meant the money wasn't even doing something positive. It was just keeping something from happening. And once I noticed that, I couldn't unsee it. The quiet costs weren't random, they were defensive. That realization didn't feel smart or empowering. It just felt heavy. When I finally tried to see it all at once, I didn't start with judgment. I just added things. A few here, a few there. Stuff I barely remembered agreeing to. It surprised me how quickly the monthly number formed. Not huge, not dramatic, just solid. The kind of number that sits there and doesn't argue back. It wasn't the kind of total you panic about. It was the kind you quietly absorb and move on from, which somehow made it worse because I realized I'd been absorbing it every month without ever acknowledging it. I wasn't shocked by the math. I was uncomfortable with how reasonable it all looked. Nothing on that list felt wasteful on its own. That's what made the total feel personal. It wasn't one bad decision, it was 100 small approvals that never felt important enough to revisit. There were also a lot of moments where I paid more than my share just to keep things simple. Splitting things evenly when I ordered less, covering an extra part because it saved time, telling myself it all balanced out eventually. And maybe sometimes it did. But I noticed how often I volunteered without being asked, how quickly my wallet stepped in before anyone else had to think. It wasn't generosity in the way people talk about it. It was speed. It was convenience. It was a way to end the moment cleanly. What bothered me later wasn't that I spent the money. It was how invisible the choice felt. I didn't feel generous afterward. I felt done. Like I'd closed a tab emotionally and financially at the same time. Over time, those moments stacked up into something that felt oddly hollow. I've always liked thinking of myself as easygoing, flexible, the kind of person who doesn't make a fuss. Somewhere along the way, money started helping me hold that identity together. It covered the small gaps where friction could have shown up. It let me stay agreeable without saying much. Looking back, I can see how often I paid to protect that version of myself. Not consciously, it just felt natural. If spending a little kept things light, then that's what I did. The strange part is realizing how rarely I asked whether that identity was actually worth maintaining at that price. I never sat down and decided to fund it. I just kept swiping. Over time, it started to feel less like who I was and more like something I had to keep up. And once something becomes maintenance, it quietly stops feeling optional. One thing I notice now is how fast I train myself to move past the pause. That tiny moment where a question could have formed, where I might have noticed the cost. I learned to skip it. Pausing felt disruptive, like it would break the rhythm of the moment. So I got good at smoothing things over quickly, answering fast, paying fast, moving on. The problem with speed is that it leaves no space for reflection. Decisions happen, but they don't register. They don't feel like decisions at all, just motion. When I look back, it's hard to remember why I agreed to half the things I paid for. Not because they were bad ideas, but because I never gave myself time to actually choose them. I wasn't impulsive. I was just always in a hurry. What made all of this harder to catch was how calm it felt. While it was happening, there were no red flags, no moments where I thought, this is getting out of hand. Everything stayed within the range of normal. Normal prices, normal plans, normal weeks. That's the part that still messes with me a little. The money didn't disappear because of one bad month or one dumb decision. It leaked out slowly through things that never triggered concern. I didn't feel irresponsible. I felt like an adult handling life. Bills got paid. Nothing bounced. And yet, when I looked at where the money actually went, it wasn't building anything. It was just evaporating in small, polite ways. The kind that never feel urgent enough to stop. Losing money quietly is strange like that. There's no moment where you feel wrong. You just feel stuck later and can't quite explain why. When I think back on it now, I don't feel angry at myself. That version of me wasn't careless. He was tired. He was busy. He was trying to keep things moving without friction. Most of the choices made sense in isolation. That's important to remember because it's easy to rewrite your own history once you see the pattern. I wasn't failing. I was just trusting that small things didn't matter. What sits weird with me now is how long I let that assumption run unchecked. I gave it years. I never really asked what it was costing me over time. Not just in money, but in attention, in awareness. It's uncomfortable realizing that you can be doing your best and still drifting. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you never slowed down enough to notice where you're going. The number that really stuck with me wasn't the monthly one. It was what happened when I stretched it out further than I usually like to think. I took one of those habits, the kind that felt invisible, and let it run forward. A few $100s a year doesn't sound dramatic, but over 10 years it starts to take shape. Over 20, It feels solid, real, not in a scary way, just undeniable. I didn't picture regret or lost opportunities. I pictured time, years passing while the same small charges quietly kept showing up, doing exactly what they were designed to do. It wasn't about what I could have bought instead. It was about how long I'd been paying without noticing. Money has a long memory. It keeps count even when you don't. That realization didn't make me panic. It just made the room feel quieter. Sometimes I wonder what it would have felt like to say no in those moments. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, just a soft no, or even a pause. I don't imagine people getting upset. I imagine a second of silence, maybe a shrug, maybe nothing at all. That's the part that's hard to sit with. I spent so much money avoiding discomfort that might have barely existed. I assumed the cost of saying no was social, awkward, heavy. But when I replay those moments now, the weight feels exaggerated, like my brain was protecting me from something smaller than I thought. That doesn't mean saying no would have been easy. It just means I might have overpaid for relief. And once I noticed that, it changed how I remember those moments, not with regret, just with curiosity. Tonight didn't feel that different from all the other nights. Same tiredness, same low-level noise in my head, same kind of moment where a decision could slide by without making a sound. I caught myself right before answering, not in a heroic way, just enough to notice the pattern showing up again. That was new, not stopping it, not fixing it, just seeing it happen in real time. The truth is, awareness doesn't flip a switch. It doesn't suddenly make every choice feel clean or confident. Sometimes it just makes the hesitation louder. I still felt the pull to keep things smooth, to keep moving, to not be the pause. The difference was that this time, I knew what the pause was protecting me from, or what it was costing me when I skipped it. I didn't feel proud. I felt human, still tired, still tempted, just a little more present than before. Later, I found a receipt folded into my pocket. I didn't remember when it got there. It wasn't a big number, nothing that would have made past me flinch. Just a quiet record of another small agreement. I flattened it out on the table and stared at it longer than necessary. Not to judge it, not to analyze it, just to let it exist. That receipt could have been any one of dozens I've carried home without thinking. That's what made it feel heavy. Not the amount, but the familiarity. These moments don't announce themselves as mistakes. They don't even feel like choices. They just show up, neatly printed, easy to fold away. I left it there instead of throwing it out, not as a reminder, just as proof that these things happen, whether I notice them or not. And sometimes noticing is the whole point.